proliferation risks associated with that.
Well, thank you, John. Everything is interconnected, isn't it? I was hearing with great interest to what Hélène and Vipin had to say. I think, but first to go to the Chernobyl thing, as you perhaps know, the IAEA is deployed in Ukraine and also in Russian-controlled territory at the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant with teams at all the nuclear facilities in Ukraine, including Chernobyl, which means that as it happened today, we have the ability to inform the international community and give a quick, prompt assessment of the situation. You remember that at the beginning of the war, not only Zaporizhzhia was occupied, Chernobyl was also occupied for a month before the Russian forces unilaterally withdrew. And at that time already there had been question of possibility of increased radiation levels. What happened last night or in the early hours of this morning was an attack with a drone, with a conventional explosive charge, which affected superficially the roof of the containment, the new containment sarcophage there, which is in and by itself a very serious thing. But of course we were able to determine that there had not been any compromise into the radiation area, and there hasn't been any release. At the same time, this indicates just 2 days ago, for the first time since we established the permanent presence of the IAEA in Zaporizhzhia, the rotation of my experts had to be aborted because of the increased military activity there. The first time we passed, and I was there, we were under fire, but after that, we had been able to rotate 26 teams from the IAEA, and the other day we had to withdraw them because there was a lot of military activity. So the first thing we have to try to get is to the end of at least this phase of the conflict without a nuclear accident there. And by the way...
Can you just clarify? You said the first time you were there, you were under fire,
yes.
Not in a fire like...
No, under fire. They were shooting at us. They were shooting at us. Someone was shooting at us.
Extraordinary.
Yeah, for more than 2 minutes when we were passing with our vehicles. So, well, and this is an example in these days, perhaps not bad to remind that when international organizations are allowed to play a role, they can play an important role. And I think it is something that we need to be reminded of. In the wider sense, what you were talking about, I think there is, obviously, these days we see it, and I had the opportunity to be in different tables today, and some dealing with energy issues. And of course, to put it in a simplified way, although it has always been there, nuclear is in a big return. There is a lot of interest in nuclear. Of course, France has always been there, but it's growing. Very interestingly, we had this cooperation with India, which is a rare event because India has traditionally been more inward oriented when it comes to its nuclear activities, and of course the United States. But there is interest in many countries of so-called newcomers that want to accede to the technology. And here, of course, we have to be reminded, because it is often the case that people ask, well, with all this proliferation of nuclear reactors, isn't it, or couldn't it be that we have proliferation of nuclear weapons dangers? And of course, the answer is that no one can start operating a nuclear power reactor or plant without having the inspectors of the IAEA checking there. So I think this brings us to the sustainment of the non-proliferation regime, and I think Vipin was addressing this issue partially in his reply. And what we are seeing after decades of a process of gradual reduction in nuclear weapons, the opposite, which is not going to be without consequences. We do not know exactly what the end result of this will be, but we have to admit, and it's not something good to admit, that there is an increased attraction of nuclear weapons. And some countries, you mentioned a couple, that are until now in very good standing with their non-proliferation obligations, are openly discussing acceding to nuclear weapons, because they say, well, after all, the existing nuclear armed countries are not in the least thinking about decreasing their nuclear arsenals. They are thinking about increasing them, modernizing them, establishing them as a permanent thing. So why not us? Why not us? We see that in the countries you mentioned. We see that in Europe, or at least very near Europe. We see that in the Gulf. So very important countries that are saying, why not us? Even in the debates about the causes and the origins of the Ukraine-Russian war, there have been a speculation about the might have beens if the then nascent independent Ukraine had not released or relinquished its nuclear weapons, although we know that would have been impossible. So I think it is important that to all these strategic considerations that we are having, we add the fact that the nuclear non-proliferation regime, and Hélène, I think you were referring to this, has served us well for many years. But if we do not care for it, it will cease serving us. And it has been serving us because there has been an implicit degree of cooperation and admission also, and since I'm sitting in the middle of nuclear powers, that they also have responsibilities. And this is very important, that we are reminded of this at different levels. The levels of the arsenals, but also nuclear diplomacy, very important, that we see the president like President Macron, like President Trump, tackling these issues without a very decisive admission that we need active nuclear diplomacy. The risks are going to increase, the non-proliferation regime will erode, and instead of 9, we will have many more, and with the implications that we can perhaps imagine.
So I'm glad you raised that, and I want to pull the thread a little bit further on non-proliferation. And I want to come back to you, Hélène, for a European perspective. We've had now both Vipin and Rafael observe that what the United States does, whether it continues to maintain its extended deterrent or not, could affect European confidence in the nuclear umbrella and could trigger a cascade of proliferation potentially. Would love to hear your perspective on that. And then I want to come back to Vipin with a flip side of that same question. So, Hélène.
Yes, it's a very central issue, really, for us. It started with Charles de Gaulle, who didn't want France to be part of a NATO, if you like, nuclear doctrine, even though I do not believe there is a NATO doctrine. There is a US doctrine, but I'm not sure if there is a NATO one. Because we didn't fit in. It was quite different, and that's the one that I try to explain and present. But we've always had, and maybe we need to specify it now and work more with not just a potential American withdrawal, because I believe that the Americans have been very clear as to the fact that they want to withdraw. Maybe, in discussion with the Europeans as to the troops and also the American equipments that are in Europe, and therefore we'll need to replace that. But the French approach has been that we have a European dimension, and if any of the European countries were to be attacked, then they would be part of our vital interests, and therefore would trigger a response by France. But of course, our nuclear policy is based on one man deciding, the president. The same applies in the United States. So we have a very quick, if you like, line to actually respond. The president doesn't actually request the parliament or anybody else if indeed he is to use the nuclear bomb. So then that needs to be worked out if there is to be really a European dimension, and in partnership, obviously, with the UK, because I do not think that France wants to do that on its own. But I'll add the second thing. It also, I think, for our European partners to rethink the fact that some European countries do have nuclear bombs on their territories today. And that is the case of Germany, for instance, being carried by American planes. So if the Americans are to pull out, what happens to these countries which today feel indeed protected, are not part of these countries that have applied, to become a nuclear country, but in effect are. So I think we need to look at those applicants maybe in the world, but also those that will, and maybe South Korea or Japan, depending on the behavior of North Korea, which is very problematic, as Iran's behavior is for another region, that you may actually have an increase of nuclear activity, if you like, on these countries simply by proxy. So I think that needs to be watched as well, because we've lived with it in Europe and we've been, happy with it. But I think the American presence or withdrawal now is putting into question, indeed, that dependency that a lot of European countries have accepted in return for a security that they were getting.
Indeed. It's uncharted territory, and I would just note, not only are they flying on American planes, they're slated to fly on the planes of allies as well, but that is a different story. Vipin and I'll just note, we're winding down our time for this session before we go to Q&A, but on the one hand, I heard you describe earlier today extended deterrence as a very successful strategy for preventing proliferation. But we also see there's another kind of multipolarity, and that is between the nuclear weapon states and the majority of states in the world that are non-nuclear weapon states. And we see this most clearly in the Treaty on the Prevention or to Prohibit Nuclear Weapons, the TPNW. And it does raise a question about what we can do to mitigate the risks of growing polarization when you have supporters of nuclear deterrence on the one hand and supporters of nuclear disarmament on the other hand, creating another kind of polarity. The pressure we talked about earlier on the Nonproliferation Treaty regime, if that regime implodes, and there are scenarios where we could see how that might happen in the near future. Does it open the floodgates to proliferation by other states?
It's a great question. I think, on the TPNW, U.S. policy has always been that the Non-Proliferation Treaty should be the primary venue and vehicle for non-proliferation. I think there's the sort of the deterrence camp and the disarmament camp, but there's also the arms control camp. And I think the deterrence and arms control communities actually have a lot more in common than is typically understood, or they themselves might admit. For the deterrence community, those who look at this world and think, what are we trying to deter, and what does it take to deter? Arms control is a huge part of that solution. And I'll note that the United States and the Biden administration in particular, now I'm going to be a homer a little bit, but we wanted a different world. The president came in seeking to reduce the global salience of nuclear weapons, did not, within a week, extended New START, and it was our adversaries that were choosing different pathways. Russia was steamrolling over every arms control agreement that we had to date, INF, New START, Outer Space Treaty, CFE, and this was not the world that the United States wanted or tried to incentivize Russia to pursue. Same with China. And so we were always prepared to have that arms control discussion. I don't think anyone in the Biden administration, and I don't think even in the Trump administration, I think President Biden and President Trump disagree about a lot of things, but I think one area where they actually probably agree is that you don't want to see a world with more nuclear weapons. And so the United States is always prepared, I think, to have negotiations in good faith on a world with fewer nuclear weapons. And if our adversaries or competitors are willing to meet us there, I think the United States is always ready and willing. And that's the world that we sought in the initial years of the Biden administration. Our adversaries chose different pathways. And so we're left in a position where if they continue down that pathway, we may have to do something that we hadn't done in decades, which is, sort of compete again in nuclear deterrence. But I don't think we wanted to do that. It was reluctant. And the adversaries still have the opportunity to get off their current trajectories. And I think that can help, sort of reduce again the global salience of nuclear weapons, put us back on a track towards that, which would be in line with sort of the spirit of the NPT. And I think the U.S. could then would be able to credibly extend deterrence to allies, which would further strengthen, sort of the risk of allied proliferation, stanch the risk of allied proliferation, and it also support and strengthen the NPT. And so this isn't just about the United States. Russia and China and North Korea, have agency here too, and they have an opportunity, I think, to meet the United States where it wants to go, which is in a different direction. So
last question is for you, Rafael, and this is perhaps the hardest question. What do we do to stem this potential proliferation cascade in an era of growing dangers, growing complexity, new technologies? Do you have what would your top priorities be?
I think the most important thing here is to maintain and keep a very active engagement and dialogue and participation in the different manifestations that a regime, this is why a regime in the classic political science definition, Cohen and etc., for those who are in the academia.
Well cited.
Is a complex, is a beautiful network of things like this, of your work nationally, of our participation in international organizations, in strengthening as opposed to weakening international organizations. Also, these organizations being keenly aware of their role and their mission, keeping also, I'm looking at our own work, not trying to expand into things that they should not be doing, like telling people how to cut salami, but really look into what their mission is. If we were able, in the middle of the war, to establish a presence, and for me personally, to talk with President Putin and President Zelensky the next day, and to be accepted in this role, is because we zeroed in our mission and what our mission was and what we were trying to avoid and prevent. And I think that can be translated into other platforms. So without being naively optimistic, I think it is very interesting to see that when, and I talk by my own experience, when you engage and when leaders are engaged, I saw it in the United States, President Macron was a great supporter of our action in Ukraine as well, then you get support. Then you get support. When it's clear that you are bridging a gap, that you can play a certain role. So, as I said, there are areas that where the IEA or other organizations do not have a role, and it's the domain of countries. I think there is also a deficit in P5 nuclear diplomacy. I think here I dare, appeal to the sustainers of the nuclear order, as we have known it for many, many years, to maintain this minimum level of dialogue, which is indispensable. Because if you look, we haven't spoken about that, but if you look at some of the other issues that we are dealing with, like the case of Iran, we have seen the fragmentation of the international consensus that used to exist and helped the IEA exercise its verification role. So a lot of work ahead of us, but I think we have to remain focused and optimistic, at least, about the possibilities and the tools we have. We need to use them.
So thank you for concluding this part of the panel on an optimistic note. And I would say no one will accuse you of being naively optimistic since you're being shot at while you're doing your work, but nevertheless demonstrating that you can get work done even in this really difficult environment. And that is an inspiration for all of us. So thank you for your courage and your leadership. Let's open the floor to questions. And I see Dan Poneman, you have a question.
Yeah, I'll have one for Rafael and one for Vipin. For Vipin, there's been a lot of discussion, including this morning, about the Republic of Korea. And in April 2023, the United States really upped the commitments in terms of the extended deterrent and got in return a re-upping of the non-proliferation commitments. One of the things that has been discussed has been, could there ever be, and if so, would it be wise to have a redeployment of any American forces on the peninsula as part of the extended deterrent? For Rafael, we now have, after COP 28, 29, over 30 countries committing to a tripling of installed nuclear capacity by the middle of the century. And the reactors will come in all shapes and sizes. You're in the front lines in terms of you're actually talking to these people. How realistic do you see what pace of a build-out? And for your own purposes, how prepared is the agency to safeguard if we are lucky enough, in my view, because of climate change concerns, to see that kind of a build-out?
Yeah, thank you.
It's a great question, Dan, and it's one that's sort of resurfaces periodically, both in the United States and in South Korea. The capability of the United States to extend deterrence to South Korea was never really in question. It was sort of the would you trade San Francisco for Seoul? And that what led to the software upgrade, or I call it the operating system upgrade. We installed a new operating system for extended deterrence to South Korea. And those who make the suggestion that, to really assure South Korea and to stanch their appetite or interest in their own nuclear weapons, redeployment of B-61s on Penn is still an option. And my response to that is the Indo-Pacific and the Korean Peninsula is not Europe. Right, sort of reach for what we do in NATO, and they sort of apply it to the Indo-Pacific. But geography matters. And my question is always, for to do what? In the Indo-Pacific, when a SLCM is fielded, and Congress has mandated we develop and field a SLCM, for the Indo-Pacific environment, it's a much more survivable and much more effective deterrent because it's essentially not visible, whereas B-61s on a small half of a peninsula are very vulnerable. And they're likely not survivable against a nuclear North Korea. They'd be the first target in any crisis or conflict. And so you're not getting a lot of deterrence bang for buck just by deploying weapons in a highly vulnerable environment. It is, there's this tendency to reach for analogs or solutions that we use in Europe for the Indo-Pacific. And I think the emergence of North Korea and China forces us to think differently, I think, about what is effective regional deterrence. And it's not the same as what we do in Europe. So, it's an option, but for to do what? I would prefer a dedicated capability for a maritime environment, which we've never had to really contend with the Indo-Pacific. And so thinking differently about that, it's not B-61s on Penn. It's something else. And I think we've already sort of, the SLCM decision by Congress, I think, will be a better solution than nukes on Penn, which are highly vulnerable.
Can we triple nuclear energy by 2050?
We can. Two factors, apart from the numbers, which are more aspirational than anything else. Two factors have converged here. One is, of course, the attitudes countries vis-a-vis climate change. There may be a debate about this, but important decisions have been taken and are being taken on the basis of the perceptions of different countries about this, combined with something new, which is a debate on energy security, which we didn't have before. So now you see, and in particular, but not only, in particular in Central and Eastern Europe, an evident, obvious interest in nuclear energy because of the functional reduction of dependency on external providers of whatever it may be. So we have the case of the Russian gas, etc. So that has led to this combination. And we see countries aiming at that. There are certain barriers in terms of finance that we are all aware. In general, not to extend myself too much, we see in any case an upward trend, which is undeniable. The United States, at the very least, fleet replacement, at the very least, new build, the whole gamut of things under the chapeau of the small modular reactors, about which we see a lot. France, other countries. So we see that as a trend that is going to happen. In our estimations at the IEA, we see at least the doubling. The tripling could be a little bit more tricky. It will depend also on the attitude of IFIs, international financing institutions. We are just opening a debate with the World Bank and others. We have to see about that. The ability of the agency to inspect and inspect more, I think it is there. It won't be a surprise that I mentioned artificial intelligence. We are smarter, we are faster in inspecting. Of course, the human factor, thank God, is very, very important, and nothing replaces a good inspector. But there is a lot of menial work, there's a lot of mechanistic work that has to do with the vast majority of countries, because let's not forget, the civil nuclear industry has never been the source of proliferation. The source of proliferation have been certain political actors that had an intent to do something. We have 32 countries, 450 nuclear reactors operating very well, and an agency that is looking after them.
Thank you. So we have time for one more question. No questions from the audience.
Maybe
yes,
I can
go ahead,
give an answer
Elaine.
to a question that I wasn't asked, but
I welcome your answer.
no, I just for the overall, it's kind of maybe more geopolitical issue. But I did a tour in Asia with South Korea, China, and Japan, and the problem, I know the United States are concentrating their attention on China, but in the region, North Korea is the problem. And it is also a problem for China now that it has a new partnership with Russia, and which is worrying the Chinese big time. And the Chinese do not see the return of the Americans triggered by the North Korean attitude as a good thing, because it's like replaying history and going back to the Korean War 70 years ago, for them. So I think the major issue that we have is with North Korea in the same way as we have with Iran, which is for the Middle East the problem, not just for Israel, but Saudi Arabia and everybody else that will be very worried about them. So I think we need to concentrate, I think, our attention, and I'm not too sure that you can actually have a role to play on a country that is problematic, and it's like throwing a stone in a pond. The ripples go everywhere, and we're all affected by them, by that erratic behavior of the North Korean president.
So thank you very much. Please join me in thanking our panelists.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.